Hi there, my name's Jeff Oliver. I'm from the University of Arizona Libraries, and I'm going to talk to you about a project that we have where we're providing opportunities for students in undergraduate humanities class to get their first experience with the Python programming language. I want to say that I'm presenting on behalf of myself and my co-authors, Megan Sensini and Mary Feeney, also at the University of Arizona Libraries. So one of the things that we've seen recently is that data science is really not just for scientists anymore. One really good example of the application of data science into other areas comes from the programming historian. They have a great suite of lessons about computer science and statistical applications in a variety of applications, including things like k-means clustering, network analyses, and supervised classification for areas that may have not received quite as much attention recently in data science. So with this in mind, we set out to create a project for the Mellon-funded Collections as Data program. This was a program that was developed to really help support the creation and delivery of viable models that can support implementation and use of collections, and these are collections like you would see in museums and libraries, to treat those collections as data. And this is what I'm going to talk about today was a project that was actually funded by that program. So this project was a grant that was written by Mary Feeney, Sarah Shreves, and our colleague Anita Hernandez at the University of Arizona for using newspapers as a collection and using the newspaper text as data. And what we did is we created a program where we had the opportunity to go into undergraduate classrooms and work with students on using newspapers from the Arizona-Sonora borderlands as a set of data. So really our purpose from the beginning was to really create a model and materials that could be used to teach how students can use digital assets like scanned text from newspapers in a computational environment to draw conclusions and inference from these data. We focused on newspapers that were published in northern Sonora, Mexico, and southern Arizona of the United States that really focused on a variety of different groups in the area and groups that were often maybe not represented well. This includes both English language papers and Spanish language papers. And it also includes papers that were really catering to certain segments of society. So papers that were dedicated to the Jewish American communities, papers that were dedicated to the African American communities, and so on. So we use these newspapers and the scanned text as the data set. And so going into classrooms in these undergraduate classes, we first started out with a pair of lessons. The first was developed and delivered by Mary Feeney, and these were an overview of the newspaper. So really looking at the data that we provided to the students. So talking about what the newspapers were, what the different communities they were reflecting, and how they can be used as data. We followed that up with a second lesson. This was created and delivered by Megan Sensini, which is an introduction to the concept of text mining. Many of the students had not had the opportunity to really get an exposure to what text mining was and what it can be used for. So it was important that Megan introduced the concept before we actually went in and started doing some of the text data mining. So going over what can actually be done with text data mining. I will say that throughout this talk, you may see links pop up on the screen. For the most part, all of these links will be available at the very end of the talk as well, including a link to the Google Slides for this talk itself. So you don't need to scramble and take down all of the links as we go. You can find these at the end of the talk. So following these two introductory workshops, then we went into the classrooms with the Jupyter Notebooks platform and actually provided opportunities for students to run Python code to do text data mining. So we decided to use Python because it is a great tool for text data mining. And it also provided an opportunity to expose students to things like open science and reproducibility. There are other tools out there for text data mining, which have a more menu-driven approach. And if we had used those, we could have maybe gone into further depth with text data mining, but we would have missed out on the opportunities for reproducibility, open science, and actual exposure to computational environments like Python. So this is what we used for our our workshop on text data mining. I'll get a little bit more into the details on the underlying infrastructure necessary to do this in a moment. Now, this really only worked because we had faculty partners. So we had 5 faculty here at the University of Arizona who integrated these lessons, the 2 introductory lessons and the Python text data mining, into their classes that they had, that they were teaching. And the faculty were also really good because they were game and they know the students better than I do. And so they were actually sort of offered themselves up as guinea pigs to go through the workshop on the Python text data mining to start with. And they provided some really valuable feedback on what they thought were strengths of the workshop and what maybe needed additional attention. So we took that feedback and revised our workshop and created a lesson that we took into the classrooms. So for this lesson that we developed for the students, we really we used an approach which is known as backwards design or reverse instructional design to actually develop this lesson. So we really started at what we wanted at the end of the day, our learning objectives to be. So what did we want the students to get out of this workshop? And I should say that this approach of reverse instructional design is something that I've gotten from my work with the Carpentries. This is not something that the Carpentries invented necessarily, but the Carpentries organization provides a really good example of how one can go about teaching technical skills and computational approaches to a variety of audiences. And reverse instructional design is one of those principles. So in this, after creating these learning objectives, these goals that we wanted the students to achieve through the lesson, we created a Jupyter Notebook that actually includes all of the Python code that was necessary to run an analysis of relative word frequency. But we restricted the parts of the code that students were going to interact with or change to just a couple of variables. All of the code, for the most part, is included in all of the Jupyter Notebooks. There was a small module that I wrote to deal with the vagaries of OCR and to tokenize the words. But again, that code is also available through the repository that all these notebooks are hosted. So this Jupyter Notebook workshop was delivered through an online in-class workshop where each student had the Jupyter Notebook open on their own computers. They were able to then work through the code as I presented it and updated code blocks along the way and executed individual code blocks. We also recorded the sessions for those courses that were being taught asynchronously, and the recordings also afforded students the opportunity to go through the material at their own pace, so they could go through it again if they wanted to. After the workshop, we also provided another Jupyter Notebook, which had a trio of sort of canned analyses. These were things where the code was set up for them to use. They weren't blank notebooks, but rather they were ones that had sort of if you've heard of a faded example, that's kind of what we used, where students really only needed to change I think on the order of 4 variables in order to run the analyses that they were interested in doing. And these allowed the students to actually do comparative work, comparing either different newspapers, different terms, to address specific questions that they were interested in looking at. And this is something that a variety of courses built into their syllabus, was to allow students to use these notebooks to address questions that they had. So for obvious reasons, a lot of students looked at things like the patterns of influenza because the newspapers that we looked at included the span of 1917 to 1919, when the world went through a global influenza pandemic. And so students were allowed then to ask their own questions and then draw their own inferences from what they found based on the relative word frequencies. one of the things we did along the way too was to get feedback from students to see how they felt about the actual workshop. As might be expected, a lot of the students were fairly apprehensive about doing programming. Many have never had experience in writing computer code, and so they were apprehensive about this. But it actually went pretty well, and some of the student responses showed that they actually enjoyed doing these lessons. And I think that was one of the most rewarding things to come out of it, is that we may not have gotten fairly deep into text data mining, but students left with confidence that they didn't had before. And I think that was one of the critical points that we wanted to get across by running this in a Python Jupyter notebook, that students actually were able to do something that they, for the most part, thought was beyond their grasp. Now, to do this, we actually needed to host Jupyter Notebooks online so that all students could be working in the same environment. The first platform we used was looking great, but about a month before we were starting the workshops, they decided to sunset their support for Jupyter Notebooks, which was not ideal for us. But we then switched over to using mybinder.org, which works really, really well with Jupyter Notebooks on GitHub. And that worked great for our workshop, which had a small subset of the data. I think there were 3 newspaper titles and 3 years worth of data. So there wasn't a lot, and it worked really well. However, in the second notebook, those canned analyses, that's where we gave students the opportunity to work with the entire data set, which was 8 newspaper titles spanning something like 50 years, which means a lot more data. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. But that we ran up against memory limitations. And so we switched over finally to the hosting service provided by the Leibniz Institute for Social Sciences. And this has worked spectacular. It's been used at least a dozen times now. We haven't had any problems at all with that. So if you're looking for hosting solutions, I would totally look at mybinder.org, or if you have larger memory requirements, the Leibniz Institute for Social Sciences has been great. So I mentioned a little bit about memory limitations. So the limitations we run up is because these data sets are quite large as far as the number of files. So there's something like 90,000 newspaper pages of data that we have. I didn't want to have to try to deal with uploading those all to GitHub and then having those try to be distributed with notebooks. So what we did is we used our institutional research data repository to host all of those data, and then use the Python to actually use the API for our research data repository to draw in those data on demand when students use those Jupyter notebooks. I should say, when developing this, there was actually a fair amount of work that went in beforehand to do the processing rather of all of the newspapers, because what we wanted to do is to have newspapers combined into a single day volume. The resources on the web have them as individual pages, so it took some processing to work through. But I will say all of these data were downloaded from the Chronicling America site run by the Library of Congress, which is a spectacular resource. They have a really well-documented API, and the support that they have is really useful. If anybody ever runs into Robin Butterhoff at Library of Congress, you have to pass along my thanks, because they provided a lot of useful help for using this API. So where do we go next with this? So this workshop has actually been reused in multiple courses, in journalism, history, and Spanish courses. So it's been versatile to use across a variety of humanities courses. It's also part of an ongoing project, which is focusing on race and ethnicity in the borderlands around the turn of the 19th century. I actually just gave the workshop 2 days ago for a class that's working on this right now. We're also working on a white paper to talk about what parts of the model work, what parts of the model need to be considered if you're interested in deploying it at your own institution. But that should be coming out in not too long. And just to close up, I wanted to just highlight the resources that we developed are all available online. There's a variety of lessons in the Story Maps platform that we used for the introduction to the data, as well as introduction to text mining. And then all of the Jupyter notebooks are available. I've provided a link to the GitHub site where you can link out to the Jupyter notebooks. We also had a repository developed for all of the text data processing, which is available. And then finally, this presentation is available on Google Drive as Google Slides. And then I've lastly provided the contact information for myself and my 3 co-authors. And I'd be happy to address any questions and hear what folks think of this if you have the opportunity. I'd like to thank ADSA again for the opportunity to present, and would be happy to take any questions folks might have.